Morning everyone, I'm Dana Leota and I'm here to talk to you this morning about one of the beautiful qualities of our relationship with God, which is the promises that God makes. Not only is our God a promise maker, but our God is trustworthy as a promise keeper. All of God's words are truth. So as we read various circumstances and stories from different ages in the Bible, we can learn not just what God promised long ago, but also how those promises and that truth extend to us today. The topic of our Monday moments during these weeks will be God's promises. Each Monday, we're looking at a scriptural promise of God for us to live into, to look for, to believe in for the rest of the week. This week, we're focusing on words from Paul, which he wrote to his Corinthian church. He was telling them about a weakness or physical ailment which he prayed for God to remove from him. But in response, he heard God tell him, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul teaches his church and us that when we are weak, it is an opportunity for God's power to work in us and through us. This is a promise to us, just as it was to Paul. As we consider this promise from God, that God's grace is sufficient in our weakness, it can give us courage and strength when we need it most, during the many trials of life. God's grace, which is love and mercy in action, is sufficient. It doesn't remove our trials or sufferings, but rather it strengthens us to carry or walk through them. Trusting God's grace doesn't mean that we submit to defeat from suffering, but that we trust that there is something on the other side of it. This is what Jesus models for us over and over, that suffering is not the end of the story. Just as Christ surrendered to suffering and the fullness of his pain on the cross, he trusted the full reality of the resurrection that stood just on the other side of it. That's what makes his weakness powerful. The fullness of God's glory is revealed in God's own weakness because it's not the end of the story. God's promise to us that his grace is sufficient is a promise that weakness is not the end of the story, but that trusting in God and in the sufficiency of his grace, we know that we can lean into weakness. For in leaning in courageously, we will have the ability to see God's glory fully revealed. It might show up differently than how we would choose or expect, but we can trust that it will show up. As we look ahead into this week, let's consider our weaknesses or our sufferings. What comes to mind for you? How can we, instead of surrendering to the urge to fix or ignore these things, lean into them, trusting God's glory to show up through them? I invite you to take a moment after this and spend some time writing about your personal opportunity to trust the sufficiency of God's grace this week. May peace show up for you this week as you do so. I'll see you later.